Hey everyone, my name is Max, and pardon me if I wasn't really looking forward to Marvel's Spider-Man. Previous games had a reputation of being, well, not masterpieces.
Oh, you think you're smart, buddy? Well, think again. I hit a bunch of cameras around here, and now I have an even better shot than I was planning. You punching me in the jaw and taking my camera. So thanks.
This time, Spider-Man is developed by Insomniac and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment, making it naturally a PlayStation exclusive. Before going any further, I'd like to point out that this review is going to contain some spoilers. I'm going to stay away from major plot points in the game, but in order to present examples, I will show footage that to some might be considered spoilers in regards to certain enemies in the game and or situations. Spoilers is something that you should expect from a review, but I like to put a warning here anyway. Furthermore, this review will not include DLCs, so the information here is about the base game and the base game only. It should be no surprise that you play as Spider-Man in a Spider-Man game. With that comes also Peter Parker, where the game takes some time to develop the relationship between him and the surrounding characters, as well as dealing with some problems of his own in between beating baddies. I can't appreciate this enough. You also eventually take control of Mary Jane and Miles Morales, but we're going to get into that much later. Peter Parker, as of the start of the game, has been Spider-Man for around 8 years now, and his time in the Bugle came and went, with him now having a job as a lab assistant. Surprisingly, I enjoyed Mr. Negative more than I expected. The same can be said about the story overall. I wasn't expecting this caliber of quality from the writing staff. If you've seen any Spider-Man movie, or MCU movie for that matter, you can see the story as becoming predictable in some occasions. I, however, don't necessarily see that as a negative. In certain moments, I knew where the story was going, sure. But the execution and handling of the characters within the journey to that specific point was superb. The narrative isn't entirely predictable though. There is a lot of mystery and intrigue surrounding some of the characters, and the writers throw a few curveballs as well as take some risks, which I loved. A negative when it comes to the story would be a pacing issue. After the tutorial mission where you take down Wilson Fisk, the game takes a good while to pick itself back up, mostly due to it having to introduce you to its world and characters. Which is a bit of a shame, because the actual story missions are incredibly interesting due to the narrative and gameplay, along with the quality cutscenes and amazing soundtrack that come with it. It should also be noted that the voice acting is absolutely top-notch. Combine that with the writing and you've got yourself some pretty good character interactions and some captivating cutscenes that echo all throughout the game.
Oscorp CFO. Wait, you don't think this has anything to do with Lee, do you?
Sorry to cook and run.
Did you just leave your clothes on the kitchen floor?
Where do you want me to,
Just the couch is fine.
See you later?
Yeah.
There are more negatives in regards to the story, but I'm saving those for later. Spider-Man's movement is done near flawlessly here. From the combat to swinging, every movement flows almost naturally, and Insomniac did an astounding job at bringing this character to life in what I believe is his best iteration yet. The web swinging, for example, is the main way of transportation, thus it needed to be handled carefully as it's such a prominent part of the game. And I think I can safely say that it's the best to date. It is timing based and you can easily determine your speed and height with some well-timed button presses. There is a fast travel option that truly feels like an option, since the main way of travel is incredibly enjoyable. You also don't throw webs towards Uncle Ben, that's always a plus. One complaint I have about the movement would be the wall crawling. This isn't an animation issue, instead it's related to the control of Spider-Man while crawling. So what happens is, if you're crawling along a wall upwards, with your camera facing the direction where you want to go, and want to move, say, down, you'll find that Spider-Man can go off in various different directions. I've often found myself fighting with the camera stick as well as the movement stick quite often in these situations. It also doesn't help that Peter has some problem with inconsistencies regarding building exteriors. As if it has a slightly bigger bump, Spider-Man will just refuse to move in that direction. Instead, it'll play the animation in slow-mo, but on a threadmill. When it comes to combat, in its most basic form, it's essentially button mashing coupled with a dodge mechanic. In its most complex, it's this, orchestra, okay? I can't think of any other words. It's this orchestra of ground attacks, airborne attacks, web swing kicks, throwing objects and dudes at enemies, lunges, dodges, gadgets, and all sorts of powers. This may sound confusing at first, but it's quite simple to perform and combo all of this in a natural fashion, believe it or not. The game doesn't overburden you with options, even though there are a lot, as most can be tracked down to one button on your controller, and the game does a good job of telling you which does what. It also helps that the combat is responsive. I never had any problem when it comes to controlling the main character of the game or hitting who I want to hit. I think this is worth noting.
You guys want to join your boss in jail? You got this coming. Hold that. Shut your mouth.
It's easy to see why people compare this combat system to that of the Arkham games. Although Spider-Man does noticeably expand on it, with a myriad of gadgets, suit mods that grant passive benefits, skills, and suit powers, abilities that are obtained by unlocking new suits, that without mentioning the powers of the main character that allow for far more freedom in terms of movement and animations. Gadgets can be upgraded individually, and some skills can be upgraded along their specific tree. It truly goes to show how deep yet player-friendly the combat is. There are, however, what seems to me, skills much more powerful than others. Perfect Dodge is one such ability, where I don't know exactly what to think of it. On one hand, it is incredibly broken, and on the other, it suits the gameplay of a Spider-Man game like a glove. Early on, the game tells you of a way to approach certain enemies, brutes requiring to be webbed up, shield dudes needing to be juked, and those wielding melee weapons needing to be launched up in the air. The only exception to this being whether they are already stunned or staggered. Perfect Dodge allows you to bypass that regardless of what type of enemy tries to hit you, as long as it's not a boss. Even those enemies that make their entrance with a cutscene are trivialized by it.
As if one deadly glowing whip wasn't enough. I don't know what I was expecting, but it was definitely not this.
Furthermore, you can upgrade the ability to have a lengthier window to dodge, to be able to instantly take down firearm enemies affected by it, and there is a suit mod that temporarily boosts damage after performing a perfect dodge. I probably wouldn't be looking so much into this ability if it wasn't available from the get-go. You can get it with your first level up perk. Essentially, after the game tells you how to deal with the enemies mentioned previously, it offers you what feels like a master key to combat. Spider-Man also doesn't have to knock out his enemies, so getting them off their feet once is all you need to later web them to the ground or a wall, and Perfect Dodge does just that. Now, I'm still on the fence regarding this. If the idea was to make you feel powerful and slippery, essentially playing into the superhero fantasy, then it does its job with flying colors. I can safely say that I felt more powerful than the average Joe. The ability also helped the fluidity of combat and avoid repetitiveness in having to do the same thing to each enemy type. If the idea was to make combat challenging, however, which it actually was at the beginning for me, then this skill can bypass the challenge. Perfect Dodge, single-handedly, has the potential of making combat significantly easier. I can't tell whether this was the intention of the developers, and I can understand that it's easy to assume that it was. Now, please notice I said potential. Unlocking Perfect Dodge doesn't flip a switch within the game's code giving you God mode. You need to actually use it, making it dependent on the player and if the enemies attempt to hit you. This, along with the ridiculous amount of gadgets and skills at your disposal during combat, leads me into recommending the harder difficulties. It is fairly easy to control large groups of enemies as well as the more tricky variety of enemies, While this remains relatively intact in harder difficulties, what mistakes are made there will be seriously punished. Combat is satisfying as hell, a joy to perform, and no doubt one of the highlights of the game. It, however, felt a bit too easy from time to time, and it's clearly not without flaws. One of the faults associated with combat would be the camera. When it doesn't glitch out, it can easily get stuck on walls and get obscured by enemies or environment. You can also find yourself dragging an enemy to the point where you're hitting something off screen. Thankfully, combat can be resumed to TODs or one-touch kills, where, as I previously mentioned, getting an enemy off their feet is enough to knock them out or immobilize them. So this particularly criticism isn't so impactful in the end. But regardless of whether I'm hitting an enemy or a sack of potatoes, I'd like to see what I'm beating the devil out of. The AI, when left alone, is completely incompetent, resulting in some of the most hilarious shit I've seen in a while. Now, one of Spider-Man's moral codes is that he doesn't kill. And at first I was pretty sure that he did kill here. But on closer inspection, I noticed that Jesus Web would save enemies from gravity. But later on, I pretty much got the confirmation that yes, he indeed lets people die constantly in this game. Also, why did the van turn into a light bulb? Now might be a good time to talk about the game's world, or city, I should say. The amount of detail found in the streets of New York genuinely surprised me, especially considering previous Spider-Man games, and yes, I know this is a really poor statement. But I went into this game expecting less, and I was pleasantly surprised. The world has some small details scattered all throughout, such as leaves on the ground, puddles, street art, trash, squirrels, the details on the roads and sidewalks. Suffice it to say, the city looks beautiful, as does the rest of the game, and in such a game where you can spend a lot of time up in the air or on top of buildings, it's nice to see that the effort was put in. The game also boasts a photo mode, well, 2 photo modes really, so you can take a better look at New York and its people. There even are some interiors when you look through windows, although these often repeat. It's a nice addition for oh my god. Civilians acknowledge you as you pass by, both positively and negatively. You can even interact with some, and others may point you towards a nearby point of interest. This helps sell the feeling that the city is alive, so to say. Add on top of that, J. Jonah Jameson's podcast that's a blast to listen to.
Handled the situation.
It's Spider-Man.
Jared, cut the call! Sorry. Hard to hear when we're talking over each other. Clearly someone traumatized by a terrifying experience.
Though no one could compare to J.K. Simmons. However, it happened to me that New York was at times awfully quiet.
My kid loves you. Can I have your autograph?
Am I in trouble?
Where do your web? Good, buddy. So I'm worried.
In addition to that, there are some popping issues. And yes, as you would expect, the game is filled with secrets and references.
Cool window, but I always get the feeling something strange is going on in that place.
As you progress through the story, you'll unlock missions sprinkled all throughout the map, and this right here might just be one of my biggest issues with the game. While the open world is beautiful, it isn't really memorable. It doesn't exactly stand out. There is only so much you can do or show in New York City. But where the game really could have done more is in its offering of side activities. There are a ton of these, okay? But they ultimately end up feeling like busy work, or something you have to do just in order to get tokens to subsequently unlock a suit that you like. Let's see, you have enemy bases, different enemy bases, different enemy bases, different enemy bases. There are a lot of bases. Too many! Other than enemy bases, you have your side quests, collectibles, landmarks, challenges, crimes, Where's Wally, research stations, and pigeons. Goddamn pigeons. Oh, and radio towers, a la Ubisoft and everything, where you unveil all the activities available in that area. Yeah, in no way I can complain there isn't any content scattered in the game's world. but what is given is unfortunately a bit too repetitive. In this particular matter, the game opts for quantity over quality, I'm afraid. The collectibles, research stations, landmarks, challenges, crimes, and bases yield tokens that can be exchanged for new suits, suit mods, gadgets, and/or gadget upgrades. There are so many activities that chances are you'll find yourself completing a quest only to find out that you've only unlocked icons spread throughout the map. The game does this far too often as you'd imagine, nearing the point of parody later on. I will now briefly go into a bit more detail into some of these. Let's first give a very brief look at the bases. These operate on the concept of enemy waves coming in one after the other. My only gripe with these, besides that there are too many of them, is that stealth, with the exception of the first wave, isn't a viable strategy. It's more insulting in the demon bases, where after you enter the building, you are automatically in a stealth position, letting you approach the situation that way if you so choose. However, it really doesn't matter, as Wave 2 will show up regardless and know your position instantly. So, collectibles or backpacks, although they don't do anything to stand out from other games, I found them interesting enough to go out of my way and collect them all. These all have a relation to Peter in one way or another and can provide some context as to what happened to certain characters prior to the events of the game. The research stations are, in my opinion, the ones that stand out the most. They provide a breath of fresh air from all the combat. It does this due to its objective being environmental. You're not exactly beating up baddies here. The side quests are actually enjoyable. However, I do have two complaints. One would be that there is a chain of side quests involving missing students, and it can easily get repetitive and thus dull. Although, the first time doing one of these quests is actually pretty interesting, as it requires you to recognize a location through a picture and traveling to said location to carry on with the quest. I personally would have liked to see more varied side quests than copy-paste of this. The second one is that there is this one side quest that requires you to be stealthy, yet it's broken. And this time broken as in it doesn't work properly. As you can see, I could freely shower who I was supposed to spy on with webs, and they wouldn't react at all. This doesn't seem to be a problem with other side quests though, as this one is particularly unique in the way you need to approach it. The last one I want to touch on are the crimes. These are most likely the type of side activities that pop up more often. While there's nothing particularly wrong with them, the ones involving car chases are ridiculously easy. And when you get a good look at them, well, you see this.
And she wants it back because you stole it to use in a robbery. Pull over.
You tell Susie she wants a POS back so bad she can talk to me.
Before this gets worse for you.
Doesn't seem all that urgent anymore, does it? Peter can engage in some puzzle minigames mostly found inside the lab. It is worth noting that while the activities are incredibly repetitive and cumbersome, they are optional, of course, except for the ones that aren't, but that doesn't mean they get a free pass for being unimaginative. Thankfully though, the combat is just so damn entertaining, and Spider-Man always has something to say related to these side activities that some of their wearisome aspects are diminished. I often found that to be my main incentive to do them, other than tokens for new suits, that is.
Hey, Sable Agents! Help! I'm being attacked by Sable Agents! Oh, wait a minute!
Your assistance is unnecessary, Spider-Man.
Oh, you can't fool me, Mr. Gruff Exterior. I know you love me, and I love you back.
Now that we've taken a good look at the game's world, the gameplay, and briefly touched on the story, I think it's time we delve into some other criticisms I have about the game. Let's start with bugs and glitches. So far, you may have seen the camera glitching out, which thankfully doesn't happen often, and the van turning into blindness-inducing white. I'm not sure I would consider the wall crawling a glitch, as well as the stealth side quest. They seem more like missteps or overlook rather than glitches or anything of the sort. But folks, there's more. I've run into 2 sound issues. One was during and after a cutscene, where an audio file just wouldn't stop, constantly remaining in the background.
Yuri, tell me.
Another was when an enemy decided to spray from the roof. I also experienced what seemed like a freeze while the game was seemingly loading textures and or models, which I don't want to show you in its entirety as Peter literally vomits the plot of the game at the exact same time, so what I'm gonna do instead is loop the freeze itself. Still, I believe this is self-explanatory. I've run into a transparent NPC, which is no news if you played a specific mission related to research stations.
I don't feel so good.
But this one was feeling particularly stubborn about it. Oh, and remember the incompetent AI? This is them now. And shortly after, this happened. This one might not be a bug, and is more than likely to be another misstep, but shortly after I completed the challenge, this transition happened. No, I did not edit this. But by far, the worst glitch I've had to experience was when an enemy got stuck inside the building. So I had to bait him to the other side, smack him twice there, bait him to the other and smack him twice over there, rinse, repeat, fall asleep until he's finally knocked out. In terms of performance, besides the freeze, I have but one standout moment. However, this one I really can't show you, but it involves the frame rate dropping significantly. Which, to be honest, wasn't all that surprising, considering the sheer amount of effects that were on screen at that moment, and I certainly didn't help by using an AoE gadget. Despite this, the game didn't crash once during my entire playthrough. Let's go over a bit more on the story. Remember that silver-haired badass looking chick that showed up in a few of the trailers? Yeah, her? Well, she's essentially the Boba Fett of this game. As in, she'll do 2 to 3 badass things, all in cutscenes, by the way, one of which is actually off screen, and then she fucks off!
I must leave New York. Recent events give me pause.
But Max, what about outside of cutscenes? Well, outside of cutscenes, she walks, breathes, and talks. Sometimes, she just talks. Thankfully, she wasn't overly used in the marketing for the game, but I still felt that her character had more potential than what was shown in game, in cutscene. The gameplay during boss battles often result in a green light, red light kind of gameplay. By that I mean, it usually goes as follows. The boss will start attacking, then you find a way to break the boss's defense, smack him a bit, let him get up, rinse, repeat until the next cutscene. Now, I love the boss fights in this game, but it's mostly due to the story, the amazing soundtrack, the banter, the visuals, the cutscenes, and most importantly, Spider-Man himself. But gameplay-wise, they aren't really impressive. I can think of one boss fight in the main story that doesn't operate on the red light, green light type of gameplay, and is instead more of a back and forth. I found this fight to be so damn good that I couldn't help but think the same gameplay could have been implemented in some other boss fights. Continuing on the subject of boss fights, this is where I'll tackle QTEs. Now, I know these can overstay their welcome, and some people just absolutely despise QTEs and how they can have a negative impact on gameplay. However, as far as I'm concerned, they're perfectly fine here. They're used to offer the player with directed cutscenes that, besides retaining a very small amount of interactiveness, can allow specific sequences to enlarge in scale. QTEs aren't exclusive to boss fights though. I briefly mentioned soundtrack, but man, let me tell you, when it kicks in, it's phenomenal. The last boss fight in particular gives me chills with how good the soundtrack for that fight is. But we don't need to go that far. Here's an example that encompasses both QTEs, scale, and soundtrack perfectly that you may or may not have seen at E3.
Need a plan. Need a plan real fast. I guess this is the plan! Come on, Pete, you got this! You got this, you got this, you got this! Please don't screw this up!
I will now talk about stealth segments featuring Mary Jane and Miles Morales that I've briefly mentioned towards the beginning of the video. These are often referred to as instant fail segments. Though enemies have varied suspicion levels, you can at times, thankfully, just run past them. Sometimes they don't spot you in places where you should easily be spotted, but when they truly spot you, that's it, thus the instant fail. While I do enjoy the stealth segments at times, they unfortunately seem to overstay their welcome. There are a total of 8 stealth sections in the game. None of these are optional, so you have to complete them in order to finish the story. Worse yet, one goes absolutely nowhere and just serves to set up a side mission that has no consequence to the plot whatsoever. This here is one of the reasons that leads me into thinking that some of them could easily be scrapped. Looking back at them, I believe 2 could have been skipped easily. Those being the second one from MJ, as well as the second one from Miles. The latter could pick up as you are about to enter Feast. I think what follows the stealth section here is great and should remain intact. There is also a third segment that I believe could be skipped, namely the Sable Outpost section, but I realize I might be slightly overdoing it here, but I believe the same end goal could have been achieved without the use of a stealth section. Just like the side activities spread throughout the world, this almost reaches the point of parody, where you would find/talk to Mary Jane, have the screen fade to black and voila, stealth sequence, awesome. It made me want to avoid her like the plague. With all this said, time to give this game a rating. I loved Marvel's Spider-Man more than I anticipated. The story is phenomenal, the same could also be said about the characters and their development. Voice acting, especially Peter's, is fantastic, more so in some of the more emotional moments. The gameplay doesn't fall behind either. Combat and movement felt true to the character. I always wanted to get into fights, and this made me want to just play the game, really. I'd like to mention that there are no microtransactions here. This is always a plus, thank you. There is also, at the time of this review, a New Game Plus mode. But, like everything, the game has flaws. Mainly how the world lacks substance in its offering of side activities, overuse of stealth segments, and a fair amount of glitches. Due to these reasons, both positive and negative, I'll give this game some tough love. Marvel's Spider-Man gets an 8 out of 10. It is a great game and has the potential of reaching a 9, but it falls too short to earn that rating for me. If you don't have a PS4, now might just be a great moment to pick one up. This game joins a library of other great exclusives that Sony's been stacking lately, and they're definitely worth playing at some point. Alright, there you go folks. I know I can be overly critical, and it might seem that I despise the game with all my being, but rest assured that is not the case. I'm honestly afraid that sometimes people might get the wrong impression of what I'm saying and take it as pure hate. But oh well. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. If you've come this far, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope to see you all next time. Take care, everyone.
I don't know what I was expecting, but it was definitely not this.